front door was unlocked. That was the first thing I noticed. After 11 days away, I'd driven 6 hours straight from Tucson without stopping except for gas, and I pulled into my own driveway at 9:30 in the evening to find the porch light off and the front door not just unlocked, but sitting open about 2 inches. A thin line of dark between the door and the frame. My wife always locked that door, even when she was home, even in the middle of the afternoon. 23 years in this house and she locked that door. It was the one habit she never broke. I sat in the truck for a moment. The engine ticked. Mob circled the neighbor's porch light across the street. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she'd stepped out to check the mail and forgotten. Maybe she'd gone to help a neighbor and hadn't pulled it all the way shut. I told myself a lot of things in those few seconds. Then I got out and went inside. The living room was dark, except for the television, which was on but muted. An infomercial, some kind of blender. The demonstration going silently on the screen. My wife's reading glasses were on the coffee table. Our crossword book was open beside them, pencil tucked in the spine, half a cup of tea on the end table, cold. Everything looked like she'd just stepped out of the room for a minute. I called her name. Silence. I went through the kitchen, the hallway, checked the back porch, called again. Nothing. I stood in the middle of the kitchen and felt something shift in my chest. Not panic. Not yet. Something quieter. The particular stillness of a house that hasn't had anyone in it for longer than a few minutes. I went back to the living room and looked at the tea again. I touched the side of the mug. It wasn't just cold. It was the temperature of the room. That tea had been sitting there for hours. That's when I went to the garage door and opened it. Her car was there. I'm 64 years old. I've been a structural engineer for 38 years, which means I spend most of my professional life being methodical, ruling things out, working from evidence. I stood in that garage doorway and I made myself think clearly. Her car was here. She hadn't driven anywhere. She wasn't outside. She wasn't in the house. She wasn't answering her phone. I tried twice on the drive home, and it had gone to voicemail both times, which I'd assumed meant she was sleeping. I went back inside and walked the whole house again, slower this time. That's when I noticed the door to the utility room was closed. We never closed that door. It opened into the small hallway off the kitchen, the one that also had the door to the backyard, and the pull-down stairs to the attic. We kept it open because the water heater was in there and my wife said the heat helped in the winter. It was closed, and there was a padlock on the hasp. There was no padlock on that door when I left 11 days ago. There was no hasp. Someone had installed both. I stood there for a long moment. Then I heard it. A sound. Low, irregular, coming from below. Not the utility room. Below it. Our house has a crawl space that runs under most of the foundation, accessible through a hatch in the utility room floor. We use it for storage, holiday decorations, old tax records, a set of luggage we hadn't touched in years. I went to the garage and found the bolt cutters I kept on the pegboard above the workbench. Came back and cut the padlock off. The utility room was dark. I found the light switch, turned it on. The hatch in the floor was padlocked too. I cut that one as well. The smell hit me first, and then I pulled the hatch open and aimed my phone's flashlight down into the space below, and I saw my wife sitting with her back against the concrete foundation wall, blinking up at the light. She was wearing the same clothes she'd been in when I left. Her hair was matted. Her lips were cracked. She was shaking, though the crawl space wasn't cold. She looked at me and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I knew you'd come back." Her voice was barely there. A whisper held together with almost nothing. I got down into that space and got her out, and I was on the phone with 911 before she was fully on her feet, and I kept my voice steady because I needed to be steady, and the whole time she held onto my arm with both hands and didn't let go. My wife's name is Rosalind. She is 61 years old. She was a middle school music teacher for 27 years before she retired. She is one of the most capable, organized, no-nonsense people I have ever known in my life. She had been in that crawl space for 8 days. The paramedic said she was severely dehydrated. Her kidneys were struggling. She had not had any meaningful food or water since the morning she was put down there. She had survived because of a small puddle of condensation that collected near the foundation drain after a rainstorm. She'd been drinking from it. The doctor at the hospital used the word remarkable more than once, and not in a good way. He meant it the way doctors mean it when they can't find a clinical word for something that shouldn't have been survivable. While they were working on her in the ER, a detective came and found me in the waiting room. He asked me when I'd last seen my wife. I told him, 11 days ago, I'd gone to Tucson to be with my father, who had suffered a serious stroke. My father was 79 and lived alone, and his neighbor had called me when she'd found him on the kitchen floor. I'd driven out the same night. The detective asked who had been checking on my wife. I said our son. His name is Marshall. He's 34. He works, or worked, I should say, in logistics for a freight company. He had a key to the house. I'd called him from the road the night I left and asked him to look in on his mother every few days, make sure she had groceries, that kind of thing. Rosalind is in good health and didn't need constant help, but I felt better knowing someone was nearby. Marshall had told me twice during those 11 days that he'd stop by and everything was fine. His exact words both times, "Mom's good, Dad, don't worry." I told the detective all of this. He wrote it down and didn't say much. At around 2 in the morning, a second detective came and found me. She sat down across from me in those hard plastic waiting room chairs, and she put a folder on the table between us, and she asked if I'd spoken to Marshall recently. I said I'd texted him when I got home and he hadn't replied. She asked if Marshall had access to any of our financial accounts. I felt my stomach go cold. Rosalind and I have a joint checking account, 2 savings accounts, and a home equity line of credit we opened years ago and rarely used. The checking and savings were through a credit union we'd been with since before Marshall was born. The HELOC was through our bank. I said he had access to the checking account, yes? He was a signatory, had been since he was 18 because we'd added him when he went to college and never took him off. The savings accounts were in our names only. The detective slid a document across the table. It was a wire transfer confirmation, $63,000, from our primary savings account to an account I didn't recognize, dated 9 days ago. I stared at it. She slid another one, a second transfer, $41,000 from the second savings account, dated 8 days ago. The same day her records showed that Rosalind had been locked in the crawl space. Then she slid a third document, a draw on the home equity line, $50,000 wired to a different account, dated 6 days ago. I did the math without wanting to. $154,000. I said, who authorized the HELOC draw? She said a power of attorney document had been presented to the bank, in my name, with my signature. I had never signed a power of attorney. I had never given Marshall authority over the HELOC. The detective asked if I recognized the signature on the document. I looked at it for a long time. It was close, not perfect, but close enough that a bank teller processing a routine request wouldn't have flagged it. Marshall had seen my signature thousands of times. He'd grown up watching me sign documents. He knew how I wrote. I said, "That's not my signature." She nodded like she'd expected that. Then she asked me about a woman named Darcy. Darcy is Marshall's girlfriend. Had been for about 2 years. I'd met her 3 or 4 times. She was pleasant enough, I thought. She worked as an office manager for a dental practice. She was 30, maybe 31. What the detective told me next took me a few minutes to fully absorb. 3 weeks before I drove to Tucson, before my father's stroke, before any of this, Marshall had asked me for a loan. $40,000. He said he and Darcy were looking at a house and needed to cover the gap between their savings and the down payment. He said he'd pay it back within 2 years. I had said no. Rosalind and I had talked about it and decided no, not because we didn't love our son, but because we'd lent him money twice before, $14,000 total over the years, and he'd paid back 11 of it and then stopped talking about the rest. We didn't want that between us again. Marshall had not taken that well. What I didn't know, what the detective explained to me in that waiting room while my wife was receiving IV fluids 50 feet away, was that in the 2 weeks after I said no, Marshall had done the following. He'd obtained a power of attorney form online, forged my signature, and had it falsely notarized by someone who was apparently a friend of Darcy's. He had then used that document to access the HELOC. He had used his own authorized access to the checking account to pull the account numbers for both savings accounts and transfer funds out using wire instructions he'd set up through a third-party service. He had come to the house 3 days after I left for Tucson, and he had, by some means, the detective was still piecing together, locked his mother in the crawl space. whether Rosalind had gone down there willingly and then been locked in, or had been put there against her will directly. My wife was too disoriented and dehydrated to give a clear account yet. Marshall and Darcy had plane tickets booked. Costa Rica, departing in 4 days. By the time the detective told me all of this, it was nearly 4 in the morning. I sat in that plastic chair and I thought about my son, who I had taught to ride a bike in a parking lot on the Saturday when he was 6 years old, who I had coached through Little League for 4 seasons even though neither of us was very good at it, who had sat at my kitchen table on holidays and eaten the food his mother cooked and looked me in the eye. I thought about Rosalind in that crawl space for 8 days. I said, "Have you arrested him?" The detective said they were picking him up that morning. They did. Both of them, Marshall and Darcy, at the apartment they shared across town. Darcy's friend, the notary, was arrested 2 days later. What happened next was slow. That's the thing nobody tells you about when something like this happens to your family. Not the initial crisis, which is its own kind of shock, but the months of slowness afterward. The lawyers, the proceedings, the motions and counter-notions and continuances. The way the legal system moves when you most want it to move quickly. I'm going to try to explain the financial piece because I know it matters, and I know from experience that people want to understand it. The $63,000 from the first savings account and the $41,000 from the second wire transfers to external accounts are difficult to reverse. But because both were made fraudulently and the receiving accounts were identified quickly, our credit union was able to work with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit to freeze the destination accounts. We recovered about $78,000 of the $104,000 from the savings accounts. The rest had already been moved through a secondary transfer and was harder to trace, the $50,000 HELOC draw, because the power of attorney used to authorize it was forged. A criminal act, not just a civil one. Our attorney filed immediately to have the draw declared void. The bank's legal team fought this for a while, which was its own kind of exhausting, but ultimately they settled. We were not held responsible for the debt. That took 8 months. Our attorney also filed a civil suit against Marshall and Darcy for the amounts not recovered through the criminal process. That's still pending as I'm recording this, but I'm not holding my breath. They don't have assets to speak of. The money, most of it, is simply gone. The criminal case was more straightforward in a grim way. Marshall was charged with elder financial abuse, fraud, forgery, and unlawful imprisonment. Darcy faced fraud and conspiracy charges. The friend who notarized the forged document was charged with felony notary fraud, the unlawful imprisonment charge. Putting Rosalind in that crawl space and leaving her there was the one that concerned me most, not in terms of the legal outcome, but in terms of what it said about my son. The prosecutor explained to me privately that charging attempted murder was difficult given the specific circumstances. There was some food left nearby, though Rosalind hadn't been able to reach most of it, and Marshall's defense was going to argue there was no intent to kill, only to keep her out of the way while he completed the transfers and left the country. I didn't agree with that framing. I want to say that plainly. What he did to his mother was not keeping her out of the way. It was putting a 61-year-old woman in a dark enclosed space without adequate food or water and leaving her there for 8 days while he drained her life savings and prepared to flee the country. But the law works within definitions, and the prosecutor's job was to get a conviction, not to match my sense of justice. The sentencing came 14 months after the arrest. Marshall received 18 years. The judge said during sentencing that the combination of calculated financial fraud, document forgery, and the imprisonment of a vulnerable person, and yes, she used the word vulnerable. Even though Rosalind is one of the least vulnerable people I know in any other sense of the word, constituted a serious and premeditated series of crimes, she said Marshall had not shown genuine remorse. She mentioned the planned escape to Costa Rica as evidence of forethought and intent to evade consequences. Darcy received 9 years. The notary received 4 years, which she will likely serve half of. 18 years. I sat in that courtroom and heard that number, and I waited to feel something specific. Relief, maybe, or the particular satisfaction that people talk about when they use the word justice. I'm not sure I felt those things exactly. I felt something more like exhaustion, the kind that goes all the way down. Rosalind was in the courtroom. She sat beside me. She has recovered physically. It took about 6 weeks for her body to stabilize, 3 months before she felt herself again. and the better part of a year before she stopped waking up in the middle of the night. Our doctor referred her to a trauma counselor, and that has helped. She is playing piano again, which she'd stopped during those months, and I take that as the truest measure of where she is. I want to tell you something about those first days after, because I think it's important. When Rosalind was well enough to understand everything, the money, the timeline, all of it, she sat with it quietly for a long time. She didn't rage the way I had, privately, in my car, in the hospital parking garage, in the shower. She sat with it, and then she said something that I've thought about many times since. She said, "I kept telling myself he'd come back and let me out. I kept thinking it was a misunderstanding." She had been locked in that crawl space by her own son, and she had spent 8 days telling herself there must have been some mistake. That's who my wife is, and that's what Marshall did to her. I want to say something to anyone who might be watching this, who is in a situation where a family member has access to their finances, their home, their trust, and where something feels slightly off. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off. A question about finances that didn't need to be asked, an unusual amount of interest in a bank account or a policy. A request that made you uncomfortable, but that you pushed aside because it was your child, your sibling, your nephew, and you didn't want to believe what you were starting to think. Don't push it aside. I am not a suspicious person by nature. I believe in family. I believe in my son for 34 years. And I am telling you from the other side of this, if something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. You are not being paranoid. You are not being unkind. You are being careful, which is what people who love you would want you to be. After the sentencing, I drove home. Rosalind sat in the passenger seat. We didn't talk much. The radio was on low, some station playing oldies she likes. The sun was going down over the hills, and the light was that particular orange gold that I've always thought is the best light in the world, the kind that makes everything look like it's worth something. She reached over and put her hand on mine on the gear shift. We sat like that the rest of the way home. My father, the reason I went to Tucson in the first place, is still alive. He's 80 now, and fragile, but he is here. He had a second small stroke 6 months ago, but recovered better than the first time. I drive out to see him every few weeks. The drive takes 6 hours, and I don't mind it. The house is the same house. Same kitchen, same utility room. I removed the hasp from the door a long time ago and patched the holes and repainted. The crawl space hatch is still there, of course. It's part of the foundation access. You can't remove it. I haven't opened it since that night. Rosalind says it doesn't bother her. I believe her, but I also haven't tested it. Marshall has not reached out, not through the prison system, not through his lawyer, not to any third party. I don't know whether to read that as remorse or indifference or something else entirely. I stopped trying to interpret it. Some things don't resolve into meaning no matter how long you think about them. I'll be 65 in the spring. I am still working, though I've cut back to about 30 hours a week, which suits me better than I expected. Rosalind is talking about going back to substitute teach, just a few days a month. She misses the kids, she says. She misses being needed in that specific way. I recorded this because people kept asking me to. Friends, and then their friends, and eventually people I'd never met. I was reluctant for a long time. I didn't want this to be a story I was defined by. But I've come to understand that keeping it private doesn't make it smaller. It just makes it heavier to carry alone. So here it is. This is what happened. And Rosalind is sitting in the living room right now, 30 feet from where I'm recording this, working on a crossword. I can hear the pencil moving when she writes an answer in. That's the sound of my life now. That sound, and everything it means. That's enough for me. I'd had a lot of time to think about how we got here. Not just to the courtroom, not just to the sentencing, but to the moment where a man I raised with my own hands looked at his mother and made a calculation. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the money. Not even the crawl space. The calculation. Because it wasn't a moment of rage or panic. Marshall didn't do this in a flash of something he couldn't control. He planned it. He sourced the power of attorney form. He found someone to fake the notarization. He timed it around my absence. He sat at some point, maybe at a kitchen table, maybe in his car, and he worked through the steps the same way I work through load calculations at a job site. Methodically, and somewhere in that process, the question of what would happen to his mother while he was gone became a variable he was willing to accept. That's what I can't explain away. That's what I've stopped trying to. What I've come to understand, slowly, the way you understand things that are genuinely hard, is that character isn't what you say about yourself. It isn't what you intend or what you believe about yourself when things are easy. It's the calculation you make when there's something you want badly enough, and the only thing standing between you and it is someone who trusted you. Marshall wanted the money badly enough, and Rosalind trusted him. I trusted him. Trust is not stupidity. I want to say that directly because I've heard it implied, not cruelly, but in the way people try to make sense of something senseless. How did you not see the signs? Maybe there were signs. Maybe there were moments I rationalized. But choosing to believe in your child is not a failure of intelligence. It is a reasonable thing to do. Most of the time in most families it works out. We were not naive. We were just wrong about one person. What I've learned, and I mean learn the way you only learn things through genuine cost, is that love and scrutiny are not opposites. You can love someone and still pay attention. You can trust someone and still keep your own name on your own accounts. You can believe in a person's character and still not hand them the keys to everything you've built, because trust is something that should be earned incrementally, in small amounts, over a long time, and even then, it has limits. Rosalind played piano again for the first time about 4 months after the sentencing. She hadn't touched it through all of it. She sat down one evening and played something slow. I didn't recognize it, some piece she must have taught a long time ago. And I stood in the hallway and listened, and I thought, this is what resilience actually looks like. Not a speech, not a declaration, just a person deciding, quietly, to come back to something they love. That's what Marshall took from her, and that's what she took back herself. He had no part in the second thing. That was all her. I think about what I want the end of this to mean. Not what lesson I'm supposed to draw, what it actually means to me. At 64, having lived through it. It means that what endures isn't what you accumulate. The money is mostly gone and the house is the same house and we are fine. It means that the people who stay, who sit beside you in hard plastic waiting room chairs at 4 a.m, who hold your hand on the drive home after a sentencing, are the ones worth building your life around. It means that doing the right thing is sometimes just getting up the next day and continuing to be the person you were before someone tried to take that from you. Rosalind is still here. I am still here. That turned out to be enough.